On a slick, rain-soaked street, a young black woman hurried past glowing restaurant windows, burdened by crushing debt and the weight of broken dreams. But when she saw an elderly man with Parkinson's being cruelly shoved into the cold by a restaurant server, she didn't keep walking. Instead, she rushed to help him, offering warmth and a hot meal. What she didn't know was that this single act of kindness would spark a chain of events that would change her life forever. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. The rain had just started to fall, light at first, tapping gently against the cracked sidewalks of Grand Avenue before quickly thickening into a steady curtain that blurred the neon lights into smears of gold and blue across the slick pavement. Amia pulled her jacket tighter around her thin frame as she walked, her worn sneakers slapping softly against puddles, her breath curling in front of her in little ghosts of steam. Her diner, or what little was left of it, sat 2 blocks down, a tired little building sagging between a pawn shop and a boarded-up bookstore. But tonight she wasn't thinking about the diner yet, her mind too weighed down with numbers she couldn't make add up, hospital bills she couldn't seem to shrink, and an ache in her chest that no coat could shield against. As she passed the glass doors of the fancy restaurant on the corner, the kind she would never dare step inside, she heard a commotion, loud sharp voices slicing through the sound of the rain. Curiosity tugged at her despite the cold, and when she turned her head, she caught the scene unfolding like a slow, painful movie. A man, a server, by the look of his crisp uniform and harried scowl, was shoving an elderly gentleman out onto the wet steps, his movements rough, impatient, his words biting and cruel. "You're making the guests uncomfortable. We don't serve people like you." The old man stumbled, his thin legs no match for the slippery stone, and he fell hard onto the sidewalk, his cane clattering loudly as it slipped from his gnarled hand. His body trembled, not just from the fall or the cold, but from something deeper, something uncontrollable. Maya saw it then, the way his hands jerked and spasmed against the concrete, the way his jaw tensed and quivered. Not the shakiness of age, but the unmistakable, brutal trembling of Parkinson's disease, advanced and cruel. Her heart lurched. Without thinking, she darted forward through the rain, her shoes slipping slightly on the wet ground, and crouched beside him. "Sir, are you hurt? Can you move?" Her voice was soft, warm, cutting through the embarrassment that tightened his face and made him avoid her eyes. Slowly, painfully, he nodded, struggling to sit up, his breath coming in short, shuddering gasps. His white hair clung to his forehead, soaked through, and the frayed cuffs of his jacket were dark with rain. But the server huffed behind them, muttering something about keeping the entrance clear. Amia didn't spare him a glance. Her world had narrowed to the old man before her, to the way his body betrayed him, to the way the expensive restaurant behind them turned away as if his suffering were an eyesore they could just wipe clean. She braced his elbow carefully, her fingers steady against his trembling arm. "My place is just down the street," she said gently. "It's nothing fancy, but it's warm, and I can fix you something to eat if that's all right with you." The man hesitated, blinking up at her, confusion and shame warring on his weathered face. But something in Amia's eyes, something quiet, kind, unwavering, made him nod once, almost imperceptibly. She smiled, not the bright, easy smile she wore for customers, but a softer one that said you matter without ever having to say the words out loud. She retrieved his cane from the sidewalk, slipped her arm firmly around his shoulders, and together they slowly made their way through the rain, her small frame supporting him every step of the way. The world around them bustled and blurred, people hurrying past without looking, cars hissing through puddles. Shop windows glowing with warmth that seemed reserved for others, but Amia only focused on the man at her side, on the careful, patient steps they took together, and on the faint, battered outline of her diner growing closer through the mist and rain, a place that, for at least one more night, could still offer someone a home. The bell above the door gave a tired little jingle as Amia pushed it open with her shoulder, the sound brittle against the heavy quiet inside, and the warmth from the old gas heater tucked in the corner rolled out in lazy waves, wrapping around them both like an old patchwork quilt. Her diner, small, a little battered, walls stained with years of love and late nights, smelled of fresh bread and a fading hint of coffee, the kind of scent that clung to the memory long after you left. Amiya led the old man to a booth near the back, the one closest to the radiator, where the cracked leather seats were still warm from the day's few customers, and carefully helped him settle into the bench, adjusting his cane so it wouldn't slip. She watched his hands, still trembling, as he tried to smooth the wrinkles from his soaked jacket, his fingers curling awkwardly against the fabric like birds with broken wings, and something sharp twisted in her chest, a mixture of anger and sorrow that the world outside could shove a man like this aside without a second thought. She rested a hand lightly on the table to steady herself, then forced a small smile. "You just sit tight, okay? I'm going to whip you up something real good. No charge, no fuss." The old man lifted his head, his eyes shining under the fluorescent lights, his voice raspy but sincere. "You're very kind, miss. Most people, they don't even look." Amiya's heart squeezed tighter, but she didn't let it show. She just nodded, slipped behind the swinging kitchen door, and set to work. The kitchen was cramped, filled with the kind of mismatched pots and pans you only found in places held together more by hope than by money, and the flickering overhead light buzzed like a tired bee. But to Amiya, it was still home. She pulled out the last of her ingredients, a bundle of collard greens, some thick slices of ham hock, a handful of sweet potatoes, and half a loaf of cornbread she had baked the night before, still tender and golden. Her hands moved on instinct, muscle memory guiding her as she chopped and stirred, the familiar rhythm soothing the knot of worry that had lived in her belly for weeks. Through the small service window she could see him, the old man sitting quietly, looking around the diner with an expression Amiya knew too well. The look of someone who had learned not to expect kindness, who sat on the edge of his seat like he might still get asked to leave. Her throat tightened, but she shoved the feeling down, focusing on the sizzle of the ham hitting the pan, the rich scent of it filling the air, stronger now, wrapping around the battered tables and cracked linoleum floors like a promise. 10 minutes later, she slid a steaming plate in front of him, the greens glistening with butter, the ham tender and smoky, the sweet potatoes soft enough to fall apart under a fork, the cornbread still warm enough to melt the honey she drizzled on top. She sat down a glass of sweet tea too, the kind her mother used to make, strong and sugared until your teeth ached. "Hope you're hungry," she said, easing into the booth across from him, tucking her legs under the table, the exhaustion of the day pressing against her bones but unable to dim the quiet satisfaction curling in her chest. The old man stared at the plate like it was a feast laid before a king, his hands trembling worse now as he picked up the fork. But Amiya didn't rush him, didn't look away, just smiled and began eating her own plate like it was the most normal thing in the world, like sitting here across from a stranger in a near-empty diner was exactly where she was meant to be. Between mouthfuls, they talked, slow at first, cautious, the old man's voice halting between the tremors of his muscles. His name was Walter, and he had been living on the edge of the city for years now, scraping by after. Parkinson's had stolen the steady hands he needed to work. He spoke of days he spent alone, the way people flinched when he tried to hand them a dollar bill, the way the world moved faster and colder now. Amiya listened, really listened, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth, her face open and patient in the low yellow light. And when Walter asked, almost shyly, about her, Amiya found herself telling him more than she had told anyone in months, about how her mama and daddy had died in a car accident when she was just a kid, how her aunt had taken her and her little sister in and raised them on diner food and second-hand clothes, how this little place had been her mama's dream once, a place to feed people, to make them feel like they mattered. She told him how tomorrow she would have to close the doors for good because the bills were too high and the debts too deep, how her aunt's hospital stays were getting longer and the medicine more expensive, how she couldn't keep pouring everything she had into a sinking ship even if it broke her heart to walk away. Walter didn't say much after that, just listened, nodding slowly, his face solemn, his hands folded carefully in his lap like he didn't trust them not to betray him even now. When the meal was done and the plates were scraped clean, Amiya helped Walter to his feet again, his cane tapping gently against the floor as she led him to the door. The rain had let up into a fine mist now, the streets shining under the streetlights like spilled silver. She flagged down an old yellow cab, pressing a few crumpled bills into the driver's hand and giving him Walter's address before turning back to the old man. "You take care of yourself, Mr. Walter," she said, her voice thick despite her best efforts. Walter caught her hand between both of his, the tremors still strong but the grip steady, with something else. Gratitude, maybe. Or hope. "I'll see you tomorrow, child," he said, a small, fierce spark in his tired eyes. "Here. Same place." Amia smiled, wide and real, even as her throat ached, even as the cab pulled away and she was left standing there alone on the cracked sidewalk, with the rain misting down around her, her diner flickering behind her like a heartbeat trying so hard not to fade out. The next morning dawned heavy and gray, the sky sagging low over the rooftops like a wet wool blanket, and the streets of Grand Avenue were still slick from the night's rain, glinting under the pale, reluctant light of the rising sun. Amia had barely slept, the weight of farewell pressing against her ribs, but she still rose early, pulling on her faded jeans and her soft, worn hoodie, her movements slow, methodical, like she could stretch time if she just moved carefully enough. The diner was colder than usual when she arrived, the heater groaning weakly against the chill, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a washed-out yellow glow over the scuffed floor and empty booths. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, keys dangling from her fingers, drinking it in, the way the place smelled faintly of coffee grounds and fryer oil, the way the sunlight tried its best to spill across the checkerboard tiles but didn't quite reach, the way the whole building seemed to exhale around her, tired, but stubborn, refusing to give up without a fight. Today was supposed to be the last day, the final goodbye to everything her mama had built with chipped dishes and love too big for the tiny kitchen to hold. And Amia had decided she would not let it end with silence. She rolled up her sleeves, tied on her apron for what might be the last time, and set to work. She didn't have much left. The pantry shelves were more bare than stocked, the produce was bruised and soft in places. But she made do, pulling together pots of hearty vegetable stew, trays of cornbread, steaming pans of scrambled eggs and sausage. The smells rose up quickly, filling the air with a warm, welcoming richness that wrapped around the walls like a goodbye hug. And they came. The regulars from the bus station. The old woman who lived 3 doors down and talked to herself. A pair of teenagers with threadbare hoodies and weary eyes. Drawn by the scent. By the open door. By the promise of one more meal in a world that didn't offer many, she served them with smiles, real ones, setting plates down with a gentle hand and a kind word, laughing when the old man from the pawn shop told her she ought to charge double for the cornbread, pretending not to notice when one of the teens slipped an extra muffin into his coat pocket with guilty eyes. She didn't care. Today wasn't about money. She was wiping down the counter with a damp cloth, humming under her breath, when she heard the door jingle again, and she turned, expecting another regular, another familiar face. But what she saw made her pause, the cloth falling still in her hand. Walter stood in the doorway, his figure a little straighter today, though his hands still trembled at his sides. And behind him, framed by the gray light, was a tall man in a dark, impeccably tailored coat, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his hair neatly combed, his face striking in that way that made people look twice without knowing why. He stepped inside after Walter, his gaze sweeping the diner once, quick, sharp, missing nothing, before settling on Amia. The man carried himself like someone who was used to owning whatever space he stepped into. But there was something else in his posture too, something guarded, cautious, almost reluctant, like he wasn't sure if he belonged here among the chipped mugs and the sticky menus and the battered jukebox humming faintly in the corner. Walter shuffled forward, his smile warm, reaching for Amia's hand with a grip as firm as he could muster. "Told you I'd come back," he said, his voice cracking just a little, and there was pride in his words, pride and something that made Amia's throat tighten. The man behind him stepped closer, hesitating only a moment before offering his own hand, his voice smooth but not unfriendly. "I'm Ethan," he said simply. "Walter's son." Amia blinked, caught off guard by the resemblance. now that she looked, the same stubborn set to the jaw, the same flash of fierce intelligence in the eyes. She shook his hand, her palm rough from years of scrubbing floors and chopping onions meeting the fine softness of a man who probably never worried about rent or grocery bills. "It's nice to meet you," she said, her voice steady even though her heart was picking up speed for reasons she couldn't explain. Ethan glanced around the diner again, his mouth pressing into a tight line as he took in the peeling paint, the mismatched chairs, the tiny army of people cradling bowls of soup with gratitude written in every line of their faces. He said nothing, but Amia could feel the weight of his silence, heavy and measuring. Walter, oblivious, or maybe just uncaring, tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "I told you," he said fiercely, the tremors making his words jerk, "I told you she was special." Ethan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and Amia felt something shift in the room, something she didn't have a name for yet. She busied herself pouring coffee into thick ceramic mugs, pretending not to watch as Ethan helped Walter into a booth, as he listened to the old man's low voice explaining how Amia had found him, fed him, sat with him like family without ever once looking at him like he was a burden or a mistake. She moved around the diner, refilling cups, keeping her hands busy because her heart was hammering in her chest now, too loud, too raw. After a while, Ethan rose, crossing the floor to where she stood behind the counter, the steam from the coffee pots curling around him like mist. His voice, when he spoke, was low and serious. "My father, he doesn't ask for much," he said, his gaze steady, "but when he does, I listen." Amia said nothing, just waited, wiping her hands on a dish towel, feeling the silence between them stretch taut. "And he wanted me to thank you," Ethan continued, his mouth twitching as if the words were unfamiliar, heavy. "I was going to offer you a check, some kind of donation, something to make it right." He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the room full of people, at the way Amia moved among them like she belonged to them and they to her. "But now," he said, turning back, his voice softer, "I think we can do better than that." Frowned slightly, unsure, the old instinct to distrust kindness from people like him, people who wore suits that cost more than a month's rent, rising up like a shield in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice weary but calm. Ethan smiled then, small but real. "Told you," he said. "I want to help you keep this place," he said simply, "not just with money, with a real chance. A partnership. A fresh start." And as the words settled into the battered old diner, into Amia's stunned silence, into Walter's proud, trembling smile, the heavy gray clouds outside finally began to break, and the first slivers of sunlight spilled across the cracked floor, golden and stubborn and full of promise. It took nearly 6 weeks, and during that time, Amia didn't sleep much, not out of worry this time, but out of a restless energy she hadn't felt since she was a child, helping her mama roll dough at 4 in the morning in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and prayers. The diner had been closed for construction, but it hadn't gone quiet. Instead, it buzzed with hammers, voices, the scrape of ladders, and the gentle hum of new life being breathed into every crevice. And Amia was there through it all, paint in her hair, dust on her jeans, working beside contractors and designers like she'd done it all her life. Because this wasn't someone else's project, this was her story being rewritten, one screw, one coat of paint at a time. Ethan hadn't hovered, but he hadn't disappeared either. He had shown up often, not always in a suit, sometimes just in jeans and a button-down with sleeves rolled, clipboard in hand, his usual air of control softened by something she hadn't expected, genuine interest, even admiration. And Walter, dear Walter, came by every afternoon, with his cane tapping out a slow rhythm against the sidewalk, watching the progress like a proud grandfather, greeting every worker like an old friend, offering opinions no one asked for and stories everyone seemed to need. The morning of the reopening came with golden light pouring through the new windows, the sky clear and full of promise, and Amia stood in the center of the gleaming new space, her heart thudding in her chest like a drum. The floor tiles were new, clean, but still in that old checkerboard pattern her mama had chosen. The booths had been reupholstered but kept their deep red color, a nod to the past. The counters shone like mirrors, and a small framed photo hung behind the register, her mother, apron on, holding a wooden spoon and laughing like the world was still simple. She wore a crisp new apron that morning, but underneath it was the same old hoodie, sleeves pushed up, and her hands shook just a little as she unlocked the doors. The crowd wasn't large, but it was full, familiar faces, old neighbors, folks who'd heard the story and come from across town to see if it was true. Just before the first customer stepped in, Amia saw him, Ethan, standing off to the side, not saying anything, just watching her with that quiet steadiness. And beside him, Walter, with his cap tilted back and his smile wide as sunrise. That day, the diner, now officially renamed Mama's Table, served over 200 meals, and not one person was turned away. Amia didn't stop moving, plating food, hugging regulars, showing new faces to their seats, but she smiled more than she had in years. And late that afternoon, after the rush had slowed and sunlight spilled across the floor like melted gold, Ethan asked her to step outside for just a moment. Out on the sidewalk, he handed her a folder, thick, official-looking, and when she opened it, she blinked at the words before her: incorporation papers, banking documents, a trust agreement. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's smile was warm but serious. "It's a foundation," he said. "The Mama's Table Foundation. You'll run it. Every meal sold here contributes to a fund that provides food and support for families in crisis. We've started it with enough seed money to last a year. After that, the more this place grows, the more people it can feed beyond these walls." Amia stared at him, her fingers trembling on the papers, her breath caught in her chest like it was too big to exhale. "You trust me to run this?" she asked, because some part of her still couldn't believe. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I've never trusted anyone more." And then Walter stepped closer, resting a shaking hand on her shoulder, his voice gruff but soft. "You fed me like family, child. Now the world gets to taste what family really means." Tears burned in Amia's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She looked at the building behind her, the way its windows glowed, the way the sign above the door caught the last light of day, and she felt her mama's spirit move through the space like a breeze through open curtains. And she knew this wasn't an ending. It wasn't even just a beginning. It was a promise, that kindness, real kindness, didn't fade when the lights went out. It planted roots. It fed people. It built legacies. And as the door swung open behind her and the bell chimed, sweet and clear, like a song returning home, Amia smiled, stepped back inside, and got to work.